The 29 Bedford Street special on the man who made the famous four even more famous. There's a connection with the legendary Glenn Miller and his last performance ever, which was in Northern Ireland, and a dance worth waiting for with an audience the like of which certainly I've never seen.
Peter Blake, the painter who created the most famous album cover in the world for the Beatles in 1967, enjoys the rare distinction of being a genuinely popular artist who also attracts serious critical appreciation. Regarded as a leading figure of the British pop art movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Blake's works are featured in the most prestigious international collections. He was awarded the CBE in 1983 and at present occupies the post of artist in residence at the National Gallery in London. What is less well known about Peter Blake is the fact that one of his most important paintings, Self-Portrait in RAF Jacket, was executed during a period of national service duty at RAF Langford Lodge in Northern Ireland between October 1952 and March 1953.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the 8 o'clock news for today, Thursday the 2nd of March. The new cabinet is due to meet for the first time this morning. Our parliamentary correspondent understands that apart from the budget, the first session of the House will not contain a heavy programme. At Lake's success, it has been suggested there should be a special session of the United Nations Assembly and that it might take place in Europe. The number of new television licenses issued last month went up by over a fifth.
Over 43 years since his first visit to Langford Lodge, Peter Blake returns to produce an initial study for a future self-portrait and revisit some of the ghosts of his past. This documentary chronicles that return and the thoughts and feelings it provoked.
As a child, I didn't really do that much drawing, just kid stuff, you know, I mean, copying Mickey Mouse and just the ordinary things that a child would do. And the reason I went to art school was pretty much chance. The man doing the interview said, you can do a little drawing exam and you can go to art school. I took the examination and got in. So there wasn't a childhood talent, really. It just suddenly I was presented with the opportunity. And I wanted to be a painter, but the general sort of feeling was that I should take up graphic design because I could make a living from that. So I did a year of a graphic design course. So by the time I started National Service, I was in this curious position of having been trained to be a graphic designer for a year. I'd got a place at the Royal College as a painter, but I'd never been a painter. And the position then was that you had to do National Service before you could go to the college.
Presenting Peter Braff and Archie Andrews with Beryl Reid, Ken Platt, Alexander Gage, Dick Embry, Ronald Chesney and the BBC Review Orchestra conducted by Harry Rabinowitz in Educating Archie.
It's going to be quite strange to be painting another self-portrait. I've only done 3 self-portraits. I did one when I was 17, still at Gravesend School of Art. The third self-portrait was painted in 1961, and the second one I would have done in 52, 53 at Langford Lodge. As a national serviceman, I led a curiously kind of charmed life. I've never quite been able to work out why. It must have been something to do with the fact that although I was working class, as most of them were, I was different. I was going to be going to art school, which they didn't quite understand. They didn't quite understand what a working class youth would be doing going to art school. I mean, there was lots of nudging about naked ladies and drawing naked ladies and you lucky sod and all that. You'll be having a good time. So there was a kind of mystery to it. There was always a card game going on. And they'd say, do you want to play? But if I didn't, they'd never pursue it. It even went as far as the NCOs and officers. I mean, they had to shout at you and always did, you know. I mean, you were part of that kind of brutal discipline of being yelled at. But in a curious way, I always felt that they yelled at me in a kindly way. I mean, they were never really cruel. The uniforms were so uncomfortable. The dress uniform wasn't too bad, but the kind of working uniform, I don't know what it was made of, but it was fantastically prickly. It felt like it was made of a felt made from horsehair, if you can imagine that. So what we would do, we would shave them. I mean, part of its purpose was that it made it possible to wear them. I mean, if you shaved the inside of the trousers, it didn't tickle so much. But also, if you shaved the jacket on the outside, it looked as though you had been in longer than you had, and it was very important how much time you'd done.
Much finding in the marsh. Murdoch, Kenneth Horne, Sam Coster, Maurice Denham, Diana Morrison, Barbara Lee, and the dance orchestra conducted by Stanley Black. And now, ladies and gentlemen, much finding goes to now.
The purpose of us coming to Ireland was very strange. We were an out party of about 10, and we didn't know where we were going particularly. And we arrived at this derelict base. We were all put into one brick building. The signals unit was set up. The cook cooked in that building, and for some time there were just the few of us. Langford Lodge had been intended as an operational airfield, but once it was finished, somebody realised that the flight path of Langford Lodge crossed the flight path of Aldergrove, which was the other RAF station in the vicinity. There was also a civil aerodrome called Nuts Corner at that time, and the planes couldn't have gone from Langford Lodge without crossing the flight path of the other aerodromes. One terrible thing I recall is after a hut had been pulled down, looking out of a window, and in the foundations of the hut were about 500 rats, large brown rats, scuttling around, and I'm terrified of any kind of rodent. I mean, to this day, I can't hold my little girl's hamster, and she can't understand it. She's always saying, "Daddy, please hold it." And I'm absolutely terrified of them. When I was posted from South Cerney to Ireland, I had no idea what to expect. I think it was the first time I'd ever been abroad as such. I'd never been to France. I'd never been anywhere like that. We travelled on a ferry from Liverpool that came straight into Belfast docks, and it was the type of ferry. Around that time, there was a terrible disaster that one of these ferries sank a couple of weeks after I first came over. So, although I didn't know about that, they were very rickety old ships. They were cattle ships with a door at one end that came down to let all the cattle on, and then was put back up. And I think with the ferry that sank, that door opened. But the first time I came across, the waves were at least 20 feet high, and I went out and just stood out on the deck all night, and the boat was full of the Irish Guards and lots of nuns, and all the nuns were being sick and all the Irish guards were drunk, and it was an extraordinary scene. And I just went up on deck and got away from it and stood and watched the waves all night. We arrived at the dockside in the morning, and it was quite a foreign scene. There were little bars along the dockside. There was probably a market of some kind, so there were women selling things, and it was all quite old-fashioned looking and sort of strange to me. Going to Belfast for the first time was a strange day, because the one thing that I found remarkable was that the policemen all looked about 7 feet high. They were carrying guns, which I'd never seen before. I mean, compared with the little sort of, local bobby on his bike that I was used to, I mean, these were paramilitary. I mean, they're very imposing men. You wouldn't want to mess with them. There wasn't any particular anti-English feeling at that point, or I didn't feel it, but there was an antagonism towards the Air Force, because around that time there'd been a pretty brutal murder, I remember, and an Air Force man was accused of it. I think the daughter of a prominent judge had been murdered, so there was a lot of local feeling. And I seem to remember that we probably stopped going into Belfast in uniform because of that, because there was just a general antagonism. I mean, it was looks rather than being yelled at, but you felt that it wasn't wise to wear the uniform into town.
Why? Always hold. Never put down. Why?
Oh, well, why couldn't you say so before? Why, he doesn't make himself comfortable. Now, let's try and get it clear.
During the short time I was here, Waiting for Godot opened in Paris. The Mousetrap opened.
There's reasoning for you.
Eva Peron died. Stalin died. I mean, things that changed the world. A lot of the atomic tests were going on, and I think it was a general fear we could all be blown up at any moment. If someone pressed the wrong button, or if the Russians decided to, we would all die. So I dreamt quite a lot that there'd been a Holocaust, and I'd wake up and there hadn't been, and I was relieved. But I often dreamt about that. The sergeants would all find out what you did. So they'd say, any artists, and if you admitted to being an artist, you either were then sent to be a draftsman, to do maps and things, or I can remember a couple of times decorating the sergeant's mess for a party with pin-up girls, as I remember. And I would often do little sketches of the other men and of their wives. I would copy photographs of their wives. RAF camps always had this strange smell of coke burning, because the kitchens were fueled by coke, and things frying and cabbage cooking. It was in the air. That atmosphere was in the air. At that particular Christmas, I had to stay behind on the camp. By then, the camp had built up to almost a full complement. So most of the men went home for Christmas. And as I remember, about a dozen of us stayed behind. It was that traditional thing of the officers serving the men. So about the 12 of us would have sat around one table, all ranks, sergeants with the men, and we were served by the officers. But it was rather a mournful time, I mean, to be away at Christmas. It was the first Christmas I'd ever been away from home, so it would have been a pretty sad time, I think. My training as an art student was very much about discipline. I did the old year of the intermediate examination in 1950, where you had to learn anatomy, perspective, the orders of architecture, silversmithing, stone carving, wood carving. My craft was Roman lettering, which was all about discipline. And I can remember afternoons doing drawing from the cast, where you were sat down in front of a plaster cast of whatever it might be, of Venus or whatever it might be, and you had to get it right. And the teacher made you stay there the whole afternoon until you got it right. And it was a good discipline, and it's helped me a lot to be the artist I am. And I think there was a certain kind of discipline in doing national service, not the being shouted at, not the parades, not that kind of discipline, but it taught me a self-discipline, it taught me an order. For instance, I still, to this day, make the bed every day in exactly the same way as I was taught to make the bed in the Air Force. I fold the sheet to 45 degrees, I tuck it in, I spread, I make sure it's smooth, almost as though I'm going to be inspected still. It was compulsory to go to church, so we would have gone to church every Sunday, and the organ in the church apparently was donated by the American soldiers. The Americans were here in the war. Apparently, the very last concert that Glenn Miller did, just before he flew off and was lost, took place at Langford Lodge, in a building which was the mess hut and now holds animals. Sitting doing the self-portrait was it was an odd experience because I was projecting myself back to try and be in the situation that I was in when I did the RAF self-portrait. And just, well, I was 18. Just a year before, I'd had a very serious cycling accident, and I'd had a lot of facial injuries. So I had a very big scar on the side of my nose and a big scar there. And they appear in that portrait. In fact, one of the reasons I grew a beard was to hide those scars. And I don't think about them often now. I mean, my mouth's a bit crooked, but you know, it's something you just live with, and people don't even notice. I mean, it's nothing. But then I would have been very aware of it. I mean, a young man, and they were still quite raw. So it was strange to be going back and being reminded of all that. There would have been no point 2 weeks ago sitting in the National Gallery thinking about myself as a young man. Coming here has necessarily made me face it. When I did national service, I just accepted that that's what you had to do. You were called up for 2 years. It was as it says, a national service. It was your duty to do it, which I suppose still has an element of the kind of jingoism of the First World War, and the courage of young men in the Second World War. It was simply there to be done. Now I wouldn't do it. Whether one would have to be a conscientious objector, I simply wouldn't do it. I mean, it seems so futile and pointless now that I'd refuse to do it.
Bless 'em all, bless 'em all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless all the sergeants and WO1s, bless all the corporals and their thinking sons, 'cause we're saying goodbye to them all, as back to their billets they crawl. You'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up, my lads, bless 'em all.